Our session goals are to identify potential funding sources for bike infrastructure in Massachusetts. We're going to focus on aspects that don't typically get a lot of attention, like feasibility studies, design, and maintenance. And I'm going to be unveiling a few more resources available on MassBike's website. Today we have Elle Segal, who's the Advocate Outreach Director for Rails to Trails Conservancy, and myself. My name is Alexis Hosea-Abbott. I'm the Regional Advocacy Specialist here at MassBike, and I've been with the org for about 6 months. And yeah, today I'm gonna have Elle take it away and talk about Rails to Trails and funding.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elle Segal with Rails to Trails. As Alexis said, I'm our Advocacy Outreach Director, and I'm excited to speak with you all today about federal funding opportunities and there'll be plenty of time for answering questions as well. So bear with me while I share my screen and get fully... Okay, hopefully everything is coming up looking nice for you guys. So again, welcome, and I'll be talking to you today about federal funding opportunities for active transportation and trails. So before we dive into sort of the nitty-gritty of active transportation, I wanted to set the stage a little bit. A lot of you are probably familiar with these things, but just wanted to highlight a few important pieces of this. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Bill, also known another acronym IIJA, was signed into law in 2021, and that provided historic funding for active transportation, including trails, which is both dedicated for active transportation, so unique programs like transportation alternatives, which we'll touch on in a little bit, recreational trails, so increased funding for those. And it also provided a lot of funding for eligible discretionary grant programs, so competitive grants that you're applying to US DOT for funding. And within those eligible programs specifically, we've seen a lot of funding go towards active transportation projects. So we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And as I said, early rounds, so we're still midway through the bipartisan infrastructure law, have indicated a lot of support for trails. Pardon me one second. Lots of grants are available for planning and new eligibilities, as well as for maintenance. So I will be flagging those as we go. So you can obviously take a picture of this. It is on our funding website. Pardon me. But these are some of the eligible opportunities. So these are going to be multimodal. You're going to be applying for funding at the discretionary grant level, so applying to US DOT, to FHWA, oftentimes competing with other projects. Some of these, I will actually correct myself, some of these are going to be through formula funding through your state, but for the most part, most of these are going to be through discretionary grant programs. So I'll go through briefly and talk about some of these. There's a couple I'm going to highlight in a little bit. But again, I want to make sure that I flag at railstotrails.org/funding. You can get comprehensive information about all of these. So the RAISE grant program, formerly Tiger Build, I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with that grant program, but that has really provided a lot of funding for trails. Don't quote me on this, but I think in the last round of RAISE, I think the majority of projects included at least an element of bike ped in their awards. So I want to double check that for you all, but we've seen a lot of preference given to bike ped projects and projects that incorporate bike ped accessibility and infrastructure into projects as well. So happy to talk more about that a little bit later in Q&A. Reconnecting Communities is really designed about, deconstructing divisive infrastructure, connecting communities that have historically been disenfranchised from access. It's been very competitive funding. They just had a huge cycle combining it with some additional funding. Again, happy to answer more in the Q&A. I'll kind of go through some of these because a lot of these are programs that have existed before. But I am going to flag a little bit more detail about the Safe Streets and Roads for All program and the carbon reduction program in the coming slides. For the rest of these programs, rural surface transportation grant. We haven't seen a ton of success for trails in that program. And then the highway safety improvement program, I'll just quickly comment. I don't know offhand if Massachusetts qualifies for this or is required, I should say, but for states that have particular amounts of fatalities or injuries for vulnerable road users, there's a requirement to spend some of that funding on vulnerable road users. So again, I don't know offhand if Massachusetts is one of those states, but either way, HSIP is a good funding source to consider. Again, all of this is going to be available at railstotrails.org/funding. So I want to talk a little bit in detail about Safe Streets and Roads for All, in part because the NOFO is now open. So very exciting. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Safe Streets and Roads for All, it is a new federal funding program created in the bipartisan infrastructure law. It provides $5 billion in funding over the course of the years on the screen. And it includes funding for planning and implementation grants. It supports initiatives really aimed at preventing injuries on roadways. And we've seen, again, I'll have to double check the statistic, but I think 80% of plans that were funded or implementation grants included elements of bike ped safety, because there's a real recognition that comprehensive safety planning has to take into account the needs of walking and biking. We really feel like connected active transportation networks should be part of any comprehensive strategy. And this is from a couple cycles ago at this point, but 46% of the 2022 Safe Streets and Roads for All construction grants, so not planning but construction, funded projects that included elements of specifically traffic separated connectivity. So we're looking at traffic separated bike lanes, paths, trails. So really excited to see the emphasis put on the traffic separated piece as opposed to just some quick build kind of work that can often be a part of the solution, but really emphasizing the need for traffic separated is great. As I said, the NOFO for 2024 is now open. I can talk a little bit more later or pull up information on the actual dates, but something that's important to flag is there are rolling applications for planning and design grants available through this summer. So I believe the first window for applications is due, I think, in April, and then I believe there's one in May and then one in August. So it's rolling. It's a rolling basis. So I'd encourage you to look into it sooner rather than later. Yeah, happy to answer more questions later in the presentation about Safe Streets and Roads for All, but wanted to flag it since the NOFO is open and it's a really great source when we're talking about bike ped safety in particular. The carbon reduction program is the next trail eligible or active transportation eligible program I wanted to talk a little bit about. This is really designed around reducing transportation emissions. So really looking at how we can reduce transportation emissions, which are the largest percentage of greenhouse gas emissions as far as sector goes. We have 65% of the funds that are given. So this is through the state. So this would be through your state DOT. 65% of those funds are going to be given based on population size, typically through the MPO that you're affiliated with or live in the region for. So that gives a lot of opportunity for the MPOs to have say over what the funding looks like. So it also gives you the chance to do a little bit more direct advocacy if you're in touch with your MPO. And for folks who aren't familiar with MPOs, again, happy to answer questions at the end. Metropolitan planning organizations, they're responsible for the regional planning and transportation needs in your metropolitan area. An important flag about the carbon reduction program is that transportation alternative eligible projects, kind of a mouthful, are eligible for carbon reduction programs. So we'll talk a bit about transportation alternatives, TA, a little bit later, because it is still the largest funding opportunity for trails and active transportation through federal funding. And importantly, this would include planning and design. So, this is going to be a great opportunity to fund bike lanes, fund traffic separated bike lanes, fund paths, fund all sorts of things, crosswalks even. But really the focus for that is going to be connecting it to reducing, your emissions. So making sure that there's data to back up kind of mode shift and things like that. As part of the carbon reduction program, just wanted to flag that states have to create strategies for sort of how they're going to use this funding, and what sorts of strategies they're going to use to combat emissions and lower emissions using the funding. And I'm sure that it exists somewhere, but I haven't had a chance to see Massachusetts' plan yet. They are supposed to be publicly available in the near future. So if anyone has been involved in this process or can speak to sort of the state DOT's efforts around creating a plan, I'd love to chat with you. We're trying to get a hold of all of these plans and just be able to assess them as far as how much emphasis they're putting on active transportation. So that was all of a little bit, very quick overview of all the different types of eligible funding. So funding that can go to trails, but can also go to ports. It can go to roads. It can go to all sorts of things. This is really looking at some dedicated funding for trails. So, there's benefits to applying for both of these types of funding programs, but wanted to flag the difference there. So I'll go through two of these in detail, the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, ATIP, and then Transportation Alternatives. And you'll see for TA and recreational trails, I'm flagging that those are eligible for trail maintenance. So those are going to be two of the best, if not the only, opportunities for federal funding for trail maintenance. So please note that. And they're going to go through mostly through the MPO, sometimes through the DOT, but just keep an eye out for those two for maintenance. I'm not going to talk in detail about recreational trails, in part because recreational trails didn't really change under the bipartisan infrastructure law. The funding level stayed the same. There weren't really too many additional eligibilities, so there's not a ton to say. But again, if you have questions, happy to discuss that during the Q&A. So wanted to start out with some transportation alternatives updates. Hopefully you all are familiar with transportation alternatives. It has been the largest funding source for trails and active transportation for many years, for decades at this point. And it takes place through competitive grants awarded by states and urbanized regions. Again, those urbanized regions are going to be MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations. 95% of the funding goes to bike ped and trail projects. There are 10 different eligibilities, including sort of stormwater drainage, other things. But again, the vast majority are going to go towards projects that are eligible or that are focused in what we're interested in today. Importantly, planning and design are eligible. Something to think about, I didn't want to give specifics on how much Massachusetts has in funding, though I can pull that information up at the end. But this is going to often take the shape of some smaller grants, which is still important, but just a key component to think about is transportation alternatives is great because all of the projects are going to be focused on active transportation. So there's a little bit less competition, but you're going to get a little bit less funding versus some of the programs I shared earlier, including RAISE or Reconnecting Communities or Safety to Roads for All. There's going to be a lot more funding available. But again, the competition is pretty intense because you're competing against other transportation projects. So something to think about in weighing how much funding you need. And we can talk more about that in Q&A. Again, some key updates to flag for you all. TA is now eligible for maintenance. It wasn't before. So that's an important thing to highlight. And again, you'd want to be in touch with the DOT and the MPO to get a sense of, if they're prioritizing maintenance. You can also try to make the case for the importance of funding maintenance because it is difficult to fund. Up to 5% of funding is available for technical assistance. So the DOT can choose to use 5% of their funds to develop technical assistance programs across the state. So that is a choice the DOT would have to make. I don't believe I've heard words of your DOT choosing to use those funds, but it's an important thing when we're thinking about equitable access to funding to consider it. And importantly, a huge change. Didn't want to bury the lead here, but nearly 70% more funding was available for transportation alternatives under the bipartisan infrastructure law. That doesn't, immediately solve all of our problems, and it's still a competitive process, and there's still often more increased need for funding. But there was a huge increase, which we're really excited about. For those of you who really want to nerd out on TA, transportation alternatives, and want to take a look at sort of what states and MPOs are doing at a more comprehensive level, we have released a white paper that's many pages long called the Transportation Alternatives Spending Report. And we also have a Transportation Alternatives Data Exchange. All of this is free and available online, so you can take a look. There should be pretty extensive data on Massachusetts's use of transportation alternatives, and happy to again answer any questions at the end. And I'm seeing a lot of questions. There are a lot of things coming up in the chat. I'm not able to monitor it live, but we'll get. I'll get back to you and take a look at a bit. The Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, ATIP, kind of a mouthful, but this is a new funding program that we're really excited about. If I could see all of you on screen instead of just the screen, I'd love to see how many of you have heard of this. Kind of raise your hands, but I can't see you all. But hopefully a lot of you have heard of ATIP. It is a new funding source, and it was authorized as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, really about supporting networks focused on connectivity. So we've been working on this program for at least a decade, and we were really excited to have it be part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, have it be created under there. It received an initial $45 million in 2023, which we are waiting for the NOFO from 2023 to come out any day now. So it's a little bit delayed because it is now 2024. But that information should be coming hopefully, by the time you've listened to this recording, it'll be out. But I want to flag the importance of this as dedicated funding at a high level for bike ped networks, for active transportation networks, and for trail networks. So this could be really game changing. We're hoping as the funding continues to grow, because that's something we're really championing, advocating for, we're hoping that we can make this kind of into a raise level program. For those of you who are familiar with raise, Tiger, or build, for that level of funding, so $20 million going to projects. We're hoping to get that level of support in the future, exclusively again for networks. That is a work in progress, and again, we are working really hard to advocate for $200 million in funding in 2024 and 2025. But that is a work in progress. Some important things to flag here. For planning and design, the total cost of the project must be, sorry, that's just $100 million, $100,000. My apologies, $100,000. Sorry about that. That really demonstrates the sort of scale of projects that they're looking to fund. Similarly, for construction projects, they want the total project cost to be $15 million. I didn't put that on the screen because I wanted to flag the planning and design element here. So before we send these slides out, I'll try to correct that so that it's not 100 million. But anyway, so yeah, really want to flag the importance of applying for this funding program. Though it is $45 million, which is a little bit on the lower end, we still anticipate a lot of planning and design projects being funded through this. The NOFO should be open in the coming weeks. So a lot more will be clarified once that is available. But I think this could be a really great funding source to think about for gaps in networks. It could be a really great way to think about how you might stack funding. There is, an element of match for here, unless you are in a low-income community. There's that 80-20 match, which I should say for almost all of these applies, unless Massachusetts provides the match funding, which I'm not familiar with that, if they do or not, but yeah, I think ATIP is going to be really important, and we would love to have you all as partners in advocating for funding. So we can talk about that later as well, what you can do to help increase funding for ATIP. Is it? Here we go. Something to flag, which we didn't get into a lot of detail, and I'm happy to kind of, when I stop sharing my screen, pull up specifics for any of these programs, but eligibility for applying for these grants. Typically, most of the primary applicants have to be states, municipalities, MPOs, or tribes. There's a few others here that, this is a comprehensive. Sometimes states aren't eligible. Sometimes there are, additional eligibilities, but for the most part, it's these types of organizations that can apply for the funding, as opposed to nonprofits and the like. I think this is my last formal slide, but again, we have so much time to answer questions, so happy to do that. I guess I went a little bit quick here, but want to make sure, and Jess, if you're able to put in the chat some of these links, some of the resources that we have. Again, this is all free. If you aren't familiar with RTC, we are a national nonprofit, really focused on helping you all in your work building trails locally. So we want to support you. So everything's free online. So the federal funding page, which should hopefully be in the chat at this point, is going to give you, again, all of that comprehensive information. We do a lot of no-fill alerts, so kind of flagging what's open, what you can apply for when. We do a lot of information on eligibilities. We have case studies of previous awardees, flagging how active transportation has received awards and sort of best practices. So all of that's available. We also have a federal funding match tool, which you can link to either in the chat or is also on that federal funding page. And within that, you're able to answer a few simple questions and get a potential match of a funding source. So they're going to ask you questions around, the amount of funding that is needed, the types of things this is going to focus on, and it's going to give you a potential source to consider applying for. A couple really great resources that I want to flag, particularly for folks who are kind of more working less as advocates as well as working for cities or MPOs. The Trail Nation Collaborative is a peer-to-peer learning network, which is about a year old. It's free. It really focuses a lot on dialogue and breaking down silos. It's interdisciplinary, so it brings together advocates. It brings together city employees, state DOT employees, MPOs, and really helps communicate about, how to come together, how to learn about best practices. So that's a really great resource. And we have a monthly newsletter that accompanies the collaborative, which includes funding sources. It includes other grants, through other nonprofits, news and updates, webinars, things like that. So it's a monthly newsletter. And a lot of great information, including access to webinars and the like. A complementary resource is something called our Trail Nation Playbook. And that is going to be a toolbox, sort of step-by-step guide from best practices we've learned across the country. It's going to include information on everything from kind of funding, which it's similar to the federal funding page, but sort of a different perspective. It's going to talk about community engagement. It's going to talk about land acquisition. It's going to be just a real wealth of information based on what we've learned from doing this work alongside communities for the last few decades. So a lot of good information available there. Again, the link should be in the chat. And then the last thing I want to flag before I move to Q&A with you all is something called Inside Track, which is our policy newsletter. It's every other month, and that's going to focus on state and federal policy. If you sign up for Inside Track, you'll also get real-time alerts around federal funding around NOFO. So it's not, just the every other month newsletter. There's going to be real-time information as well, but in those you're going to get information on what other states are doing, state policy. You're going to get information again on what we've seen when we've analyzed federal funding awards, what we've seen in case studies. So it's a really good resource as well to consider signing up for. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen if that's all right with you all. And again, happy to go back to any of these slides if you want. I believe they will be sent momentarily. Hopefully I will be able to correct that one typo before they're sent out, so I don't misinform you all. But again, happy to spend a lot of time answering questions. And thank you all for your generous time.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hold questions to the end. Dan, I see your hand up. And I have just like 4 more slides to share, and then we can start questions. Great. Jess, is the screen being shared for back to the original slide deck? Pending. Just a second. Okay, great. To complement Ellie's work on the national level, I'm going to focus on specific funding for Massachusetts. Jess is going to provide yet another link in the chat, which is a new resource we have on our website, which is just, basically it's going to take you to a spreadsheet. Then the spreadsheet will have tabs on federal, state, and private foundations and NGO resources. We all know about Mass Trails. I saw Amanda join, but there's also 12 other state agencies that offer funding on bike-related projects here in Massachusetts. And I was also able to find through my research close to 40 private sector grants. Some of them are Massachusetts only and others are nationwide. And when possible, I tried to find grant recipients that have already been awarded that are in the region for good examples, and I tried to link those on the spreadsheet. So the new page, as linked below, is MassBike Funding Finder, and about halfway down through the page, there'll be another button, sorry for all of the chasing on the internet, to just a Google spreadsheet. Next page, please. Thanks. Yeah, when looking for funding, be sure to cast a wide net. Biking is transportation, it's recreation, it's micromobility, it's access to nature, climate action, urbanism, the list goes on, physical health, mental health, community building. And because of that, the funding sources also come from all of these different avenues. You can find stuff in the climate sector, you can find stuff in the local developers need to contribute to their community, so they might want to help you build a bike path for placemaking and urbanism. And the spreadsheet will follow all of those resources. And also, I highlighted, just like Ellie was talking about with her newsletter, there's a ton of resources out there with other people collecting people together and flagging grants all the time. And so I have a list here of multiple newsletters you can sign up for. Funding is a moving target. Things get sunsetted and created every year. Projects, especially with COVID, change frequently. And I understand that signing up for a ton of newsletters is going to be information overload. But if you have a separate account for your bike ped group that's shared with your other people in your group, I strongly recommend following all of these groups. And the last resource I made available for us today is a advocacy library report. They're much like the Trail Nation. I'm looking for it on this sheet. There's other design guides and audit tools and presentations on biking trends, inspiration, case studies, etc. So I tracked them all. I've been collecting them and I posted them on our website. So you can read to your heart's content about current information on biking information. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. And our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on the Bike Summit on March 25th.